Don't invite her this year, she ruins every holiday. Laura Carter said it quietly but not quietly enough. They were standing in my kitchen right beside the counter where I had just set down a tray of cinnamon rolls. The oven was still warm behind me. The smell of sugar and butter filled the room like it always did this time of year. Daniel was there too, leaning against the island, arms crossed, saying nothing. Michelle stood near the sink scrolling through her phone, her expression unchanged. And Laura, my daughter, was the one who said it. Mom just makes everything about her. She added softer now, like she was explaining something reasonable. It's easier if we just keep it small this year. Easier. For a moment, no one moved. No one looked toward the doorway where I stood. They didn't know I was there. The tray in my hands tilted slightly. Porcelain touched porcelain with the faintest click. Not loud enough to draw attention, just enough for me to feel it. I steadied it without thinking, fingers tightening along the edge, careful not to let it slip. From where I stood, I could see the side of Laura's face. Calm, measured, not angry, not emotional, just certain. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a small, quiet sound. Not disagreement, not approval. Just something in between, like he had already accepted the direction of the conversation. No one said my name. No one asked, "What do you think Mom would want?" No one paused long enough to wonder if I might be close enough to hear them. That's when it settled in. This wasn't frustration. It wasn't a bad day. It wasn't something said in the heat of an argument. This was a decision. I stood there for another second, maybe too long enough to understand that nothing else needed to be said. Then I stepped back just enough for the hallway to swallow the sound of my breathing and turned away before the tray in my hands could betray me. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. My name is Helen Carter. I'm 74 years old, and until that evening, I believed I understood my place in my family. I didn't. Before I go on, if you're listening to this from somewhere in the world, I'd love to know where. And if stories like this mean something to you, you can always subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I carried the tray upstairs without remembering how I got there. The hallway felt longer than it usually did, the light dimmer somehow, though nothing had changed. My room was exactly as I'd left it that morning, bed-made curtains half open, the quiet kind of order that comes from habit more than intention. I set the tray down on the dresser. Only then did I notice my hands were still tense, fingers slightly curled as if I were still holding on to something fragile. For a moment, I just stood there, not crying, not angry, just still. Across the room, a photograph sat on the nightstand. It was one of the older ones, Daniel and Laura, when they were young, sitting at the kitchen table in this same house, flower on their cheeks, laughing about something I can't remember anymore. Robert had taken that picture. He always liked moments like that, unplanned, a little messy real. Back then, holidays weren't perfect, but they were ours. I walked over slowly and picked up the frame. The glass was cool under my fingers. I didn't look at it for long, just enough to recognize the feeling it carried and how distant it had become. Downstairs, I could still hear faint movement, a chair scraping, a cupboard closing, life continuing as if nothing had just happened, as if I hadn't just heard exactly what they thought of me. I placed the photo back where it belonged and sat down at the edge of the bed. My house, my kitchen, my holiday, and somehow I was the one who didn't belong in it. I didn't try to explain it away. I didn't tell myself Laura didn't mean it or that I had misunderstood. There was a clarity in her voice that made those kinds of comforts feel dishonest. She meant it. And the others didn't stop her. I took a slow breath, letting it out just as carefully. I realized something then, not all at once, but enough to feel it settle into place. I had spent years making sure everything worked, every detail, every meal, every tradition. I knew who liked what, who needed what, who would forget to bring something unless I reminded them. I made it easy. And somewhere along the way, easy had become invisible. I sat there a little longer, listening to the quiet of my own room until even the sounds downstairs faded into the background. It wasn't the words that stayed with me. It was how easily they had been said. I had always thought silence in a room meant peace. That night I understood it could also mean something else entirely. It was a strange feeling seeing your place in someone else's life so clearly and realizing it had already been decided without you. I didn't feel the need to go back downstairs, not to ask questions, not to correct anything. There was nothing to correct. I looked around the room once more at the small familiar things I had built my life around, and for the first time in a long time, I let the silence sit without trying to fill it. Sometimes the hardest part isn't hearing something painful. It's recognizing that it was never meant to be hidden. I stayed there until I knew one thing for certain. Christmas this year would not happen the way it always had. Not in this house, not like before. I didn't go back downstairs. Not that night. The house settled into its usual quiet after they left the kind of silence that used to feel earned, like the end of something full and warm. That night, it felt unfinished. I stayed in my room for a while, long enough for the sounds of car doors and engines to fade, long enough for the scent of cinnamon to thin into something faint and distant. When I finally came back down, the kitchen looked almost exactly the same. The tray of rolls was still on the counter. No one had touched them. I stood there for a moment, then covered them with a cloth the same way I always did when I expected people to come back for seconds. Old habits don't disappear all at once. They linger, especially the ones built around other people. There was a time when this house felt different during the holidays. Not bigger, not brighter, just fuller. Robert used to say you could measure a good Christmas by how much noise it made, not music or television, but people talking over each other, laughing too loudly, arguing about nothing that mattered. We didn't have much in those early years. We counted every dollar twice before spending it. Gifts were smaller. Decorations stayed up longer than they should have because replacing them wasn't something we could do every year. But there was always something steady underneath it all. Something that felt like it couldn't be taken away. I remember one year the furnace had gone out just a week before Christmas. The house was colder than it should have been, and we spent most evenings wrapped in blankets sitting closer together than usual. So we adapted. We cooked with the oven door cracked open, letting the heat spill into the room. Laura insisted on hanging decorations anyway, even if her fingers went numb. Daniel tried to build something out of spare wood in the garage, something that looked like a tree if you tilted your head the right way. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Back then, no one needed to be invited. They just belonged. Things didn't change all at once. They never do. It started in small ways, the kind that are easy to excuse. Schedules got tighter. Work became more demanding. The kids built their own lives, their own routines. Holidays had to be planned instead of simply expected. Let's do dinner earlier this year. Can we keep it simple? Don't go through too much trouble, Mom. At first I listened. I adjusted. It seemed reasonable. So over time I made lists. Quiet ones. The kind you don't write down because they live in your head. Laura doesn't like too much cinnamon. Daniel prefers his coffee stronger than it should be. Michelle will eat salad if it looks fresh enough, but she won't touch anything too heavy. I remembered everything. Not because anyone asked me to, but because it felt like part of keeping things together. Over time, I stopped waiting for them to offer help. It was easier that way. If everything was ready before they arrived, no one had to feel burdened. And no one did. The holidays became smoother, quieter, more efficient. Everything worked, exactly as it was supposed to. I looked around the kitchen, the same counters, the same table, and tried to remember when it stopped feeling like a place we shared and started feeling like a place I prepared. They didn't stop coming. They just came differently, like guests. They arrived when it suited them and left when they were ready, and I let them. Because it was easier than asking for something I wasn't sure they would give. Standing there in the quiet, I began to understand something I hadn't let myself consider before. Care, when it isn't seen, has a way of changing shape, and somewhere along the way I had made it possible for mine to disappear. I didn't mean to go looking for anything that night, at least not at first. I told myself I was just cleaning up, finishing what I had started earlier, restoring the house to its usual order. The kitchen came first. Dishes, washed, counters, wiped, everything returned to its place. It was automatic, almost comforting. But when I reached the drawer near the end of the counter, the one I rarely opened anymore, I paused. Inside were things I didn't need every day but couldn't quite throw away. Old receipts, notes, a small leather-bound book. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. For a second, I almost put it back. But I didn't. I carried it to the table and sat down. The chair creaked softly beneath me. The house felt even quieter here, the kind of silence that waits. I opened the book. The first pages were older than I expected: groceries, utility bills, small repairs. Back then, every dollar had a place. I turned a few pages. The handwriting changed over time. The notes became less about survival, more about something else: support. It started simply. A note next to Daniel's name helped with rent. Laura, car repair. Michelle, medical copay. Each entry was small, reasonable, explainable. I kept turning pages. Daniel, mortgage support. Laura, credit card, holiday expenses. The pattern didn't appear all at once. It built quietly. Over time, I stopped writing temporary because it didn't end. The entries stopped feeling like exceptions. I sat back, the book open in front of me, and let the weight of it settle. Rent, utilities, tuition for Sophie, childcare, holiday expenses. Not random, not occasional. Structured, some monthly, some every few months, some tied to the same time every year. Regular enough to be counted on. I hadn't thought of it that way before, because none of it had felt like a burden. That was the truth. I had set it up to be easy. Transfers scheduled so they didn't have to ask. Bills handled before they became problems. Accounts arranged so access was already there, authorized, limited, but present. It wasn't careless. It was intentional. I wanted them to feel supported, not dependent. And for a long time, I believed that's what I had created. I turned another page, then stopped. I didn't need to add anything up. The pattern was already clear. Sitting there, I realized something I hadn't named before. There is a difference between giving because you want to and giving because it's expected. Somewhere along the way, that line had shifted. Not suddenly, but enough that I could see it now. They hadn't demanded anything. They didn't have to. I had made it easy enough that asking became unnecessary. And when something becomes unnecessary to ask for, it begins to feel like it was always meant to be there. I closed the book slowly and rested my hand over it. For years, I thought I was holding things together, but maybe I had been building something else, something that didn't need me to be seen, something that only needed me to keep giving. I looked around the kitchen. Everything was exactly where it should be, and for the first time, I understood order isn't the same as balance. I stood up slowly, leaving the book on the table. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to explain. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be true, and some changes don't begin with conversations. They begin with decisions. I turned off the light and stood there for a moment in the dimness. Then I reached for my coat. I knew where I needed to go. Just not tonight. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was restless, but because something had settled too clearly to ignore. Once you see a pattern for what it is, it doesn't fade when you close your eyes. It waits. By morning, the house felt the same. Quiet, orderly, familiar. But I moved through it differently. I made my coffee the way I always did, strong, a little too hot, and stood by the window while the first light settled over the street. People were already on their way to work. Cars passing, routines beginning. It all looked steady from the outside. I suppose that's what I had created too. Something that looked steady. I set the cup down, picked up my coat, and left the house without turning back. The Wells Fargo branch on SE 13th Avenue hadn't changed in years. Same glass doors, same neutral colors, the kind of place designed to feel both official and unremarkable at the same time. Inside it was quiet. A few people waiting, a teller speaking softly to someone at the counter. Nothing urgent, nothing unusual. I checked in at the front desk and asked to speak with an account manager. When they called my name, I followed a young man down a short hallway into a small office. He introduced himself, Evan, I think, and asked how he could help. I sat down, placed my bag on the chair beside me, and folded my hands in my lap. I'd like to review all recurring transfers and authorized access on my accounts, I said. He nodded, turning to his screen. Of course. Are you looking to adjust, or I'd like to cancel them? That made him pause. Not in a dramatic way, just long enough to confirm he had heard me correctly. All of them, he asked. Yes. He clicked a few keys, eyes scanning whatever came up on his monitor. I could see the reflection of numbers moving across his glasses. There are several scheduled transfers here, he said carefully. Some monthly, some quarterly, a few tied to external accounts, I know. And you'd like to stop all future occurrences? Yes. He hesitated again, this time more deliberately. Some of these may already be in process for this billing cycle, he said. Depending on timing, a few payments could still go through. That's fine, I replied. Let them, but nothing after that. He studied me for a moment as if trying to decide whether to ask something more personal. Then he nodded and continued. One more thing, he said. There are a few users with authorized access, limited but active. Would you like to modify those permissions? I'd like them removed. All of them. Yes. There was no emotion in my voice, no hesitation. He worked quietly for a few minutes, explaining each step as he went. Transfers canceled, permissions revoked, external links disconnected. It wasn't complicated. That was the part that stayed with me. All those years of making things seamless, of setting systems in place so no one had to ask, and it could all be undone in a single morning with a few signatures and a handful of confirmations. When he turned the screen slightly toward me, I reviewed the changes. Everything was clear. Clean. For the first time in a long while, I could see the structure without being inside it. You'll receive confirmation notices for each change, he said. Is there anything else you'd like to update while you're here? I considered that for a moment. Then I nodded. Yes, I said. I'd like to make sure everything going forward reflects only my decisions. He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. By the time I left the bank, the air outside felt different. Not warmer, not brighter, just quieter. Not the kind of quiet that comes from absence, the kind that comes from something being resolved. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove across town to Whitaker & Sons, the law office Robert and I had worked with years ago. The building was older than most around it, tucked between newer developments that tried too hard to look established. Inside, the receptionist recognized my name, even if she didn't recognize me right away. I have an appointment, I said. She nodded and asked me to take a seat. A few minutes later, I was shown into an office where Mr. Whitaker's son, Michael, I remembered now, was waiting with a file already open on his desk. Mrs. Carter, he said, standing to greet me. It's been a while. Yes, I replied. It has. We sat down and he asked how he could help. I'd like to review and update my will, I said, and any associated estate planning. He listened carefully as I explained. Not everything, just enough. I didn't speak about the night before or what I had heard. I didn't frame it as a reaction. I framed it as a decision. We went through the existing structure first. It was straightforward. Everything divided in a way that assumed continuity, family, shared understanding. The quiet expectation that what I had would eventually pass to them. I had agreed to that once. It had made sense then. It no longer reflects what I want, I said. He nodded, making notes. What would you like to change? I took a breath, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to say it clearly. I'd like to set aside a portion for a local scholarship, I said, in my husband's name. Something practical. Trade school vocational training. He believed in that. Michael looked up briefly, then nodded again. We can arrange that. And I'd like to make a provision for someone who has been consistently present in my life. I didn't need to explain Patricia Walker in detail, not her kindness or the quiet way she showed up without expectation, just her name. We adjusted the structure carefully, making sure everything was documented properly. Specific, intentional, not assumed. At one point, Michael asked if I wanted to include conditions or stipulations regarding my children. I considered that. Then I shook my head. No, I said. I don't need to control what happens after I'm gone. I just need to be clear about what happens before that. He didn't question it. By the time we finished, the paperwork was in motion. Not finalized yet, but aligned with what I had decided. When I stepped back out onto the street, the afternoon had settled into a steady rhythm. People moving past, conversations blending into the background. The ordinary pace of a day that didn't know anything had changed. But something had. Not in the world around me, in the space I occupied within it. For years, I had allowed my money and my care to move together, indistinguishable from one another. Now for the first time they stood apart, not disconnected, just defined. And as I walked to my car, I realized that distinction mattered more than anything I had done before. Because once you see where something ends, you finally understand where you begin. I didn't take the decorations down from the attic that year. The boxes stayed where they had always been, stacked, neatly labeled in my handwriting, each one holding a version of a Christmas I used to build piece by piece. For a few days, I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, waiting until it felt necessary. But the truth was simpler. I didn't feel the need to do it. And for the first time, neither did the house. Mornings passed quietly. Coffee by the window, the same chair, the same view, the same steady rhythm of people moving through their lives. There was comfort in that, but it no longer felt like routine. It felt like choice. One afternoon I went to the store without a list shaped around anyone else's preferences. I bought what I liked, not what Laura preferred, not what Daniel would eat without comment, not what Michelle might politely accept, just what I wanted to cook. Back home, I moved through the kitchen without urgency, no timeline, no expectations waiting to be met. I made a meal for one, and when it was done, I sat at the table and ate it while it was still warm. No one arrived late, no one checked their phone, no one left early. The space across from me wasn't empty. It was simply mine, not empty, just no longer waiting to be filled. For years, I had spent my time anticipating other people's presence, preparing for it, adjusting to it before it even arrived. Without that, the hours opened up, not lonely, just unclaimed. Across town, I knew things were moving the way they always had. Plans being made, messages exchanged, assumptions carried forward without question. Laura would organize everything within a time frame that worked for her. Daniel would fit himself into it, relying on the fact that things would come together in the end. Michelle would contribute in her own way, something arranged, something presentable. They had their rhythm, and for years I had been the part of it that no one named. The house. That was another thing I saw more clearly now. This place they came to, every year the table they sat at, the kitchen they moved through, it had always been mine. Not symbolically, practically. The mortgage had been paid, the repairs, the upkeep, the quiet decisions that kept everything standing as it should, those had been mine too. They didn't live here. They visited. But over time the distinction had blurred. The house had become something assumed. A place that would be ready. A place that would hold everything together without needing to be acknowledged. That evening, I walked through it slowly. The living room where the tree usually stood. The dining table where it would be extended to fit everyone. The kitchen where I had spent so many hours making sure everything was just right. All of it was still here, but it no longer felt like something I was preparing. It felt like something I could finally see. A few days later, Patricia Walker stopped by. She didn't call ahead. She rarely did. She knocked once, then stepped inside when I opened the door carrying a small paper bag. "I was baking," she said. That was enough explanation. We sat at the smaller table by the window. She unpacked what she had brought, simple things, nothing arranged, nothing formal. We talked, not about plans, not about schedules, just about the day. There was no effort in it, and that was what made it feel real. Before she left, she paused at the door. "You're coming over on Christmas, aren't you?" she asked. "You and Olivia, nothing big, just dinner." I didn't hesitate this time. "I'd like that," I said. She smiled and left without saying anything more. The invitation stayed with me, not as something I had to prepare for, just something that existed. That night I sat in the living room, the lights dim, the house quiet in a way that no longer felt incomplete. For years I had believed that what I built here, the meals, the structure, was what held everything together. Maybe it had, but now, as Christmas drew closer, I could feel something else taking shape. Not a loss, just a shift. Across town they were preparing the way they always did, assuming everything would come together, assuming the space would be there, the food, the warmth, the details they never had to think about. because I had always made them happen. Every year, without fail. Until now. I leaned back in my chair and let the thought settle without pushing it away. This Christmas wouldn't be different because I stepped back. It would be different because for the first time nothing would be there to take my place. Christmas morning arrived the way it always did, quiet at first, then slowly filling with movement. Only this time it wasn't in my house. Across town, Daniel unlocked the front door just after 10, one hand holding a box he'd picked up on the way, the other already reaching for his phone. Michelle followed behind him, adjusting her coat, glancing around the entryway, as if expecting something to meet her halfway. "Smells different," she said after a moment. Different wasn't the word. There was no smell at all. No trace of cinnamon, no warmth from something cooking too early, no quiet hum of preparation already underway. The house felt exactly as it always did on an ordinary day, clean, still untouched. Daniel stepped further inside, setting the box on the counter. "Mom probably hasn't started yet," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "We're a little early." They weren't. Laura arrived a few minutes later, keys in hand, already mid-sentence as she stepped through the door. "I told you we should have coordinated the timing." She stopped when she saw the kitchen. "Did she go out?" No one answered. Michelle moved toward the stove, lifting the lid of a pot that wasn't there. Nothing. She opened the oven. Cold. Daniel frowned slightly, pulling out his phone. "Maybe she's picking something up," he said. "Or running late." "That's not like her," Laura replied, her voice quieter now. It wasn't. For years, everything had been ready before anyone arrived. The timing wasn't something they had to think about. It just worked. Michelle set her bag down and reached for her phone. "I thought catering was already arranged," she said, scrolling. "Didn't she say she'd take care of it this year?" Daniel nodded. "She always does." Laura stepped closer, her expression tightening just slightly. "Check the confirmation," she said. Michelle tapped through her messages, then paused. "There's nothing here," she said. "What do you mean, nothing?" "I mean, nothing. No confirmation, no delivery window, nothing scheduled under my name." Daniel exhaled, already dialing. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. "Hey, Mom," he said after a second, his tone still casual. "We're at the house. Just wanted to check where you are. Call me back." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, but his hand didn't move away right away. Laura crossed her arms. "Try again." He did. Same result. Michelle looked down at her phone again, then up at the others. "Maybe it's under a different account," she said, "or maybe it hasn't processed yet." Daniel shook his head. "It always processes. That was the point. It always did." He walked over to the cabinet, opening it out of habit, reaching for something he expected to be there. It was. But it wasn't enough. "Check the account," Laura said quietly. Daniel hesitated. Then he nodded and pulled his phone out again, opening the banking app they had all grown used to using without much thought. For a second, nothing happened. Then the screen loaded. He stared at it. His expression didn't change immediately. It shifted slowly, like something adjusting beneath the surface. What Michelle asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. He tapped the screen once, then again, as if that might change what he was seeing. "It's not there," he said finally. "What's not there?" "The transfers? The balance?" Laura stepped closer. "That doesn't make sense." Daniel turned the screen toward her. "There's no access," he said. "It's gone." Michelle moved in beside them, her voice tightening. "That's not possible. We've always had access." "Authorized access," Daniel said, more to himself now than to them. "She set it up years ago." And now Laura asked. He shook his head. "It's not active anymore." For a moment no one spoke. The room held its breath around them. Michelle tried her own phone, opening the same app, navigating through the same familiar steps. Her fingers moved quickly at first, then slower, more deliberate. "I can't get in," she said. Laura reached for her bag, pulling out her phone, checking something else, credit messages, anything that might explain it. Nothing did. The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was uncertain, The kind that comes when something you've never had to question suddenly doesn't behave the way it always has. Daniel looked around the kitchen again. The counters were clean. The table was empty. The house was exactly the same. Except for the one thing that had always made it work. She didn't forget, Laura said finally. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Michelle's voice came softer this time. Then why Daniel didn't finish that thought. Instead, he picked up his phone again and dialed. Voicemail. Again. He lowered it slowly, his hand lingering in midair for a second before dropping back to his side. For years, none of this had required effort from them. The food appeared, the space was ready, the details were handled, they showed up. That was enough. Until it wasn't. I imagine that was the moment it began to settle in, not all at once, but enough to feel the shift. That something they had always relied on had stopped. Not broken. Stopped. If you were standing in that kitchen watching it unfold, what would you have thought in that moment? Would you have realized right away what had changed? Let me know in the comments. And if you're following along, a like always helps more than you think. No one moved for a while after that. Not toward the stove, not toward the table, not toward the door. They stood there in the middle of a house they had always known, surrounded by the absence of something they had never needed to name before. And for the first time there was nothing there to guide them. No structure, no rhythm, no quiet system working in the background. Just the four of them. And a space that no longer knew what it was supposed to become. No one was quite sure who moved first. The silence had stretched long enough to feel heavy, pressing into the space between them. Daniel stood near the counter phone, still in his hand. Laura hadn't uncrossed her arms. Michelle remained by the sink, staring at nothing in particular, as if waiting for something to correct itself. It didn't. Sophie Carter was the one who broke it. She had arrived quietly later than the others, slipping into the house without the same expectation. She paused in the doorway, taking in the stillness, the absence of everything that should have been there. "What's going on?" she asked. No one answered her directly. Daniel glanced at her, then away. "Your grandma isn't here," he said, as if that explained anything. Sophie frowned slightly, setting her bag down. "Didn't she say she was hosting?" "She always does," Laura said. The words landed differently now. Sophie looked around the kitchen, her eyes moving over the empty counters, the untouched space. Then without asking, she walked past them toward the hallway. "Where are you going?" Michelle asked. Sophie didn't stop. "I'm just checking something." No one followed her. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries memory more than sound. Sophie moved toward the small desk near the living room, the one Helen had used for years, the one no one else really paid attention to. She opened the top drawer. At first, there was nothing unusual. Papers, envelopes, things that had been there for a long time, but as she shifted a few items aside, something caught her attention. A stack of receipts. Not new, not recent. Organized. She pulled them out slowly, flipping through them one by one. The dates stretched back further than she expected. Catering orders, grocery purchases, utility payments, transfers, some printed, some handwritten notes attached. Each one tied to a time she remembered without realizing she remembered it. "Dad," she called softly. This time, they came. Daniel stepped into the hallway first, followed by Laura and Michelle, their footsteps slower now, more uncertain. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Sophie didn't answer right away. She handed him one of the receipts. He looked at it, then at another, then another. The pattern didn't take long to see. "This is from last year," he said quietly. Sophie nodded. "And the year before," she added. Laura reached for the stack, flipping through it more quickly now, her eyes scanning the amounts, the dates, the names attached to each charge. "No," she said under her breath. "That's not, but it was." Michelle stepped closer, her voice tight. "She paid for all of this." No one answered, because the answer was already there, in the ink, in the dates, in the repetition. Every meal, every arrangement, every detail they had assumed simply existed. It hadn't. It had been built, maintained, funded by her. Daniel leaned against the wall, the receipts still in his hand, as if the weight of them had shifted into something heavier than paper. "We never," he started, then stopped. Because there wasn't a sentence that could follow that, honestly. They hadn't asked, they hadn't needed to, it had always been there. Laura's voice came quieter now. I thought we all contributed. Not enough. Not in the way that mattered. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled. Slowly. In the spaces between what they remembered and what they had never noticed. Back in the kitchen, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Across town, in a smaller kitchen with softer light and no expectations to meet, I sat at a table that wasn't mine. Patricia Walker moved easily between the stove and the counter, not rushing, not measuring anything too precisely. Olivia set plates down without asking where they should go, adjusting them, once then leaving them as they were. There was no schedule, no performance, just the quiet rhythm of people who were present because they wanted to be. "This is enough, isn't it?" Patricia said at one point, almost to herself. I looked at the table, at the simple meal, at the two of them. And I nodded. "Yes," I said. "It is." We ate slowly. No one checked the time. No one waited for something else to arrive. Conversation moved in small circles, returning to itself, not because it had to fill space, but because it belonged there. For the first time in years, I wasn't anticipating the next need, the next adjustment, the next detail that required my attention. There was nothing to manage, nothing to hold together. Just the moment as it was. And it was enough. Later, when I stepped outside for a moment, the night had already settled in. The air was cool, still carrying the distant sounds of other homes, other gatherings. I stood there for a while, not thinking about what might be happening elsewhere, not wondering who had called, not waiting for a message that might or might not come, because I understood something now in a way I hadn't before. I wasn't missing anything. I had simply stepped out of something that no longer needed me in the way I had believed, and in that space, something else had made room for itself. Quiet, steady, real. I took a slow breath, letting it out just as carefully. Peace, I realize, doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it's something you recognize only after the noise has faded. I stayed there until the cold settled lightly against my skin, then stepped back inside, closing the door behind me without hesitation. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to listen for it to open again. Daniel came alone. There was no call beforehand, no message to explain his arrival. Just a knock at the door late in the afternoon, quieter than usual, as if he wasn't entirely sure it would be answered. I opened it without asking who it was. For a second, he didn't speak. He stood there with his hands at his sides, empty, no box, no bag, nothing to soften the space between us. "Hi, Mom," he said finally. "Hi, Daniel." I stepped back to let him in. He moved slowly through the house, his eyes taking in things I hadn't changed and the things I had. The decorations were still in the attic. The table was set for one, not many. The air carried none of the usual urgency. We sat in the kitchen. Not across from each other in the way we used to during busy holidays, but at the smaller table by the window where there was no room for distraction. "I went by the house," he said. "I know." He nodded, looking down at his hands. We didn't understand what was happening. I didn't answer right away. "There wasn't anything to understand," I said. "Not until now." He let that sit. "I should have noticed," he said after a moment. "All of it." "Yes," I replied, not unkindly. "You should have." There was no sharpness in the words, just truth. He took a breath as if preparing to say more, then stopped himself. For once, he didn't try to fill the silence. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "Or to fix it quickly." "No," I said. "You're not." Because there was nothing quick about this. He looked up, then meeting my eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. "I don't know what it looks like going forward," he admitted. "That makes two of us," I said. Another pause. But it wasn't the same kind as before. This one wasn't built on avoidance. It was built on acknowledgement. "I didn't think about where everything came from," he said. "I just assumed it would be there." "I know. And now it isn't." He nodded again, slower this time. "I don't expect things to go back," he said. "They won't." I said it gently, but I didn't soften it, because that was the part that mattered. He stayed a little longer after that, the conversation moving in small, careful steps, not trying to rebuild anything in a single afternoon, just learning how to sit in a space that no longer worked the way it used to. When he left, he didn't say he would call. He didn't promise anything. He just nodded once, the way people do when they understand that something has changed, even if they don't yet know what comes next. Laura came the following day. She knocked harder. Not impatient, just certain. When I opened the door, she held herself differently than Daniel had, straighter, more composed, as if she had already decided how this conversation would go. "Can I come in?" she asked. "You can." She stepped inside, her eyes moving quickly, assessing, taking in the absence of the usual details. I didn't realize she said almost immediately, "How much you were doing?" "No," I said. "You didn't." She pressed her lips together, then nodded as if accepting that. "I thought we were all contributing," she continued, "in different ways." "Not in the ways that mattered," I said. She didn't argue. That surprised me. Instead, she sat down, folding her hands in front of her. "I don't want things to stay like this," she said. "Like what? Separate?" I considered that. "They're not separate," I said. "They're just clear." She looked at me, trying to understand the difference. "And what does that mean for us?" she asked. "It means you don't come here expecting things to be ready," I said. "It means you come because you want to be here, and if we do, then we'll see." It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a rejection either, just a boundary. Michelle arrived last. She hesitated at the door longer than the others had. When I opened it, she gave a small, uncertain smile. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she said. "You're here now." She nodded and stepped inside. Her conversation was quieter, less structured. She didn't try to explain everything or tie it into something that made sense immediately. "I think we got used to things," she said, without realizing what that meant. "Yes," I said. "You did." She looked around the kitchen, then back at me. "I don't expect you to go back," she added. "I won't." "I know." We sat for a while after that, not saying much. It wasn't uncomfortable, just unfinished. One by one they had come. Not together, not coordinated. Each of them carrying a different understanding of what had happened and what it might mean. I didn't close the door on them, but I didn't open it the way I used to either, because some things don't return to what they were. They become something else, and whatever came next would have to be built differently.